Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
And I got out of the car with the passports in one hand, the other hand open to show it was empty. And the soldiers were totally taken by surprise. But the officer quickly came forward with his revolver in his hand.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Ron McKai further recounts his experiences in Romania, a country teetering between Soviet influence and a desire for independence. Among many stories, Ron visits an RAF base in the UK where his brother was a crew member of a Vulcan bomber, Britain's nuclear deterrent at the time. Ron is quizzed in detail by the Royal Air Force about the locations that he's visited in Romania. Back in Romania, Ron navigates the intricacies of its society and shares stories of friendships forged under the watchful eyes of the Securitate, Romania's feared secret police. From a duck shooting party at a Communist Party hunting lodge to a tense encounter with tanks near the Soviet border, Ron's stories are filled with suspense and unexpected twists. I'm delighted to welcome Ron McKai to our Cold War conversation. July 1968, you're advised to leave Romania and return in September. And whilst you're in the UK, you have a series of interesting encounters, I'll say, because at one point you bump into Ron Walker, the Mackay engineer.
Well, I had a few days free because I'd gone to visit my brother on his Vulcan base in, I think it was Waddington, and he was busy. And he lent me his wife's car and said, come back in 3 days' time. So I drove up to Derby and called Ron Walker, and he refused even to recognize who I was. And I was puzzled by that, and I kind of insisted, maybe too much. And he said, I'll see you back in Romania. Don't call me again. So I took off from Derby. I was driving down the A1, and there was a hitchhiker in uniform on the road, and I stopped to pick him up. And conversing with him, he was in the TA, he was in the engineers, he was on a particular exercise. He was going to be trying to get to Brussels as cheaply as possible. And so as we talked, he asked me what I did, and I explained I worked in Bucharest. And immediately I mentioned that, he panicked, asked me to stop the car and let him out, because I think he thought I was a plant who was trying to cause him problems with the exercise that he was on. You know, how was he going to deal with somebody from Romania? But from there, I went further south towards Oxford, I think it was, and I discovered that the hose, the radiator hose on the car had gone, and I just happened to be close to a garage. I cruised to the garage, and as the mechanic put a new radiator hose in, he started talking to me and said, what do you do? I said, I'm teaching. Where about? I said, Bucharest. Ah, he said, you're the shortwave radio operator. And I said, what? He said, come on, everybody knows it. Apparently that estate, what was the estate called? He said, that's where they're trained, so you must be one of them. And it was completely out of the blue. And then it was 3 days up, so I went to join my brother at his RAF base. And he invited me that evening to the mess and had to lend me some clothes, because in those days, RAF officers' messes, you had to dress well, and I didn't have good enough clothes, so I was wearing my brother's clothes. We went into the bar, and the wing commander's wife saw me as a new face, and she came over and introduced herself and asked me who I was. And I said to her, I'm a teacher. I've been in Bucharest, and I'm just going back to Bucharest shortly. And she panicked as well. She grabbed me by the hand, dragged me over to her husband, and said, "Darling, darling, this nice gentleman, he works in Romania, Romania, behind the Iron Curtain." So that was a bit of a. But the following day, my brother took me to their QRA room, which was it's the quick alert system that the
quick reaction alert for the
quick
Vulcan
reaction
nuclear bomber.
alert, where they could get a bomber with a deterrent on it into the air within about 14 minutes or something like that. And I was in the QRA room with with the pilots and the navigators, and they were all dressed, ready to be called when the siren went. But suddenly there was only myself and one other person in the room, and I thought that was a little bit strange. But he started talking to me and asking me where I had traveled in Romania. And so I mentioned some of the more tourist type places. My mother had come out and I'd taken her on a holiday around Romania quite extensively. And he said, you've been in Galatz, I believe. And I said, yes, I was. I was in Galatz. Well, tell me about it. What does it look like? Tell me. And he was curious about the hotel that we had stayed in. We had got there that one night to the hotel, to Galatz, and there was a brilliant new hotel just built, covered in windows, in glass. Very unusual for Romania at that time. And he was very interested in the hotel and asked me the dimensions of the hotel, the height of the hotel, and stories, how long it might have been. And it was only years after that, actually, when I was writing the book, that I mentioned to my brother, what was that all about? And he told me that the radar in those days, maybe still, didn't handle glass surfaces very well, and maybe water as well. I don't remember now. But one of the V bombers had been converted to take aerial survey photographs from considerable distances from the Soviet Union. And they sometimes were confused by shiny surfaces. And so he was trying to get a closer take on Galatz from me.
Wow, never a dull moment with you, Ron. Never a dull moment. So when you return to Bucharest, this is after the
invasion of Czechoslovakia.
the invasion of
Yes.
the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Did that change the atmosphere at all there?
Yes, it did. It changed the atmosphere in that because Romania had not joined the other Warsaw Pact forces in the invasion of Czechoslovakia, some Romanians thought, well, we're going to take a more independent line. But that was probably true in terms of trade and in terms of relations with China and Israel, and certainly with Britain as well. But it wasn't true internally. What Romanians were afraid of was that there had been some kind of trade off made with the Soviet Union. Yes, Ceausescu, you can take a more independent line with your foreign policy, but you've got to crack down even further internally in the country. And so there was this dual concern inside the country that the Securitate was going to be even worse than it had been prior to the Czechoslovak invasion.
And why did you go back for a second year? You enjoyed it so much you wanted to go back?
I'm not sure the word enjoyment is exactly the right word. In those days, we didn't look for fun or enjoyment. It wasn't quite the word we used. I found it fascinating. I had put so much effort into learning Romanian, learning how to survive and be content in the country that I wanted to cash in on all of the effort that I had made in that first year. And I made a promise to myself for my second year. In my first year, I had been very careful about not getting any Romanian into trouble. And so I tended not to follow through on invitations or offers of friendship, because I was told either they will get into trouble, or they will be Securitate, or they will be informants. So when I went back, I said, what you're going to do this year is you're going to assume that any Romanian who tries to make friends with you is either an informant or a Securitate officer, or they know better than you how to protect themselves. And so I made many more friendships and many more close friendships than I had done in my first year, because I gave the responsibility of looking after themselves to the Romanians and didn't take it on my own shoulders.
You have a Romanian girlfriend?
Yes, that was one of the approaches of many made to me by Romanian people during that year. Um, she was actually a student in my class, and she followed me in the street one day, and to find out whether she really was following me or not, I turned off the main boulevard onto a side street and stopped, and she talked to me on the side street. And so she was making the offer of friendship to me. And what she wanted, or what her mother wanted, was for me to be her private tutor in English language and literature, so that she would come out top of her class, which she would have done anyway without my intervention. An extremely bright young woman. She was 19 years old when I met her. And so we began to meet up every week or 10 days, either in a park or then my apartment, and we became closer friends. So that was a very satisfactory step. I obviously had question in my mind whether or not she had to inform on me. Her mother had been a Communist Party member, had a very important job with a state institution in Bucharest. So I assumed that at least her mother had to indicate that her daughter was being privately tutored, and more by a Westerner, but that she knew how to protect herself. So that was, I'm going to call her M, because she defected in 1969, and we're still friends. She lives in the United States of America. I actually managed to get her into Edinburgh University after she defected in 1969. I discovered that as the ex-exchange professor of phonetics in Bucharest University, the title had a certain cachet. And so when she asked me if I could try to get her into Edinburgh University, I went along to see the professor, Angus McIntosh, a delightful gentleman who had worked for British intelligence during the war. I didn't know that at the time. And he had actually worked in Bletchley Park. So when I explained to him that I was the ex-professor of phonetics at Bucharest University, and that I had a young, bright defectee who wanted to get into Edinburgh University, but had no papers at all other than an expired Romanian passport and the authority of the British government to stay in Britain as a refugee, he admitted her into Edinburgh University, and she did herself proud, she did me proud, and she did Angus McIntosh proud by graduating top equal of her year 2 years later, when she took her MA in English language and literature.
Wow. Wow. I put that down to the teacher who originally taught her the English.
No, I played a very minor role in everything in Romania. Uh, she was an extremely bright person. She actually met and married her German professor in Edinburgh during her student years there. She was 2 years in Edinburgh, and she went back to Germany with him. And then from there, after a few years, she emigrated to the United States of America, and she had a stellar career in banking and in business.
Wow. Well, how did she get out of Romania in the first place?
She was one of 3 names I gave to the cultural attaché as potential recipients of scholarships to spend a year abroad in Britain. I had to tell the cultural attaché of my relationship with her because I didn't know whether it would exclude her being put forward as a candidate or not. But he told me that he was glad I had told him that, not to number the candidates in terms of ranking, and that the decision would be made by a committee that I did not sit on. And it was the responsibility of these candidates to get their own passports from the government if they were chosen as the selected student. Well, she was ruled out by the Romanian government as not being a suitable candidate, and they gave her some paltry excuse, whatever it might have been. But her mother insisted that she go and ask for a travel passport. You could get in those days, there were 3 or 4 different kinds of Romanian passport. There was the passport that Germans or Jews could get, which got you out of the country, but which never allowed you back into the country again. So it was basically a one-way passport. You could get a passport which allowed you out of the country on an official tour for 10 days or 2 weeks. And she got one of these passports, I understand. It was a tour to Vienna. And she got that passport, went to Vienna, stayed with, I think, family that they had in Vienna, and then came to London. And a Jewish refugee organization helped her get refugee status in Britain, clothed her with secondhand clothes, and gave her a small allowance. And then she got into Edinburgh University, and she was partially financed by relatives in the United States. So that's how she got out. But when she applied for the passport, it was very interesting because there are always dolls within dolls in Romania, and I'm sorry that my stories are dolls within dolls, but I have to go back to a point where I voluntarily taught an evening class at what was called the Popular University in Bucharest. And in that class, there were 7 or 8 students, all of whom were working. It was an evening class, it was for working people. And one of the students, a gentleman in his 40s, came to me after the first class and said, Professor McKai, I am the manager of a factory some distance away in Alexandria, and I can't come to class every week. Would you meet me every now and again in town and bring me up to date on what I've missed? Well, life in Romania was lonely, and so I was always happy to visit, to have somebody, to have coffee with somebody. And this was my second year, and I had been open to these kinds of approaches. So I started meeting him in a cafe in downtown Bucharest. Well, my girlfriend, found out about this. I must have mentioned it to her. And she said, I would like to see him. I said, well, how can you do that? Well, next time you're going to meet him in the cafe, tell me where it is, when. I will come into the cafe, I will buy a cake, and I will leave again. Don't recognize me. I won't greet you. I just want to see him. And Romanians made all kinds of strange requests. And sometimes it was wise to give in to them because they didn't make requests lightly. So that's what she did. I told her when I was going to meet Alexander from Alexandria, we called him. And when she came in, bought something, left again. When she was interviewed by Securitate for her passport, she walked into the Securitate officer's office, and it was Alexander in a major's uniform.
Wow. That's a great story. That was there any moment that you sort of doubted her as to whether she was working for the Securitate or somebody else?
Yes, inevitably, you could never be certain of any Romanian. You couldn't be totally certain that they were not an informant or working for Securitate, but you put that doubt in the back of your mind. I was 99% certain that she was not, maybe even 100% certain. But there was one day that I she led me into a situation in which I was actually afraid, probably more afraid than I have ever been in my life, even since then. We were we were going from downtown to my apartment uh, on Marashești, Balcescu Marashești, in the bus. And typically, she would travel in the front of the bus, I would travel in the back of the bus. You never traveled together with a Romanian friend on public transport. And so I was getting ready to come off at our usual stop when I saw her just give me a shake of the head. So I thought, okay, I'll stay on as well. So I stayed on, and we took another 2 or 3 stops down to uh, Parcul, a park that we sometimes walked in. And I thought, we're going to walk in the park. But she made for a building on the corner of the park, which was a beautiful building. It was a cross between a Mason's Lodge and a Western church. A very beautiful building. I had passed it many times and was puzzled as to what it might be. There was always a guard at the door. Well, she walked past the guard into this building and disappeared downstairs. And the interior of all buildings in Bucharest were very ill lit in those days. So I thought, I have no idea where she's going, but I'm going to go in as well. And I knew how to walk past a guard. You walked past with your head held high, and you called him comrade and looked at his eyes so that he looked away and walked quickly past him. And usually, if you called somebody comrade, they thought that you were probably a member of the Communist Party, and so they didn't interfere with you. Well, I got down the stairs into a long marble passage, ill lit, and I couldn't see any doors in the passage. I could see in the darkness squares on the walls. And there was M waiting for me. And she asked me a ridiculous question. She said, "Do you know where you are?" And I said, no, I have no idea where I am. And she said, "This is the Sanusha." And I didn't know the word Sanusha. I knew it had a relationship to ashes. It means ashes. And she said, "This is the columbarium where the urns are kept from people who have been cremated. And this part we're in now is for Hungarian Jews. And this is my father's plaque on the wall." And she showed me the plaque on the wall where her father had died. He had been a Communist Party member, had held an important position in Casa Schinteia, which was the publishing house in Romania, and had died very young. So that was the time I was afraid going down these stairs into that darkness. I thought, well, have they got to her to a point where she's giving me up and I'm entering the Lubyanka? That's what it felt like.
No, I can imagine. I can imagine. Now, there's various other characters who you become friendly with during your second time back in Romania. Can you tell me about Dudu Popescu?
Yeah, Dudu Popescu, I don't remember exactly how we met, but he was um, definitely not an informant or Securitate. Shortly after he was an engineer, he'd be in his 40s, very intelligent, good conversationalist, one of the few people who would speak to me continuously in Romanian and not go into English because he didn't speak any English. He told me that he had spent time in a labor camp because when he was a student, he had made a comment one day among his students to say that he thought the United States was as far advanced as Russia was technologically. And he was arrested for that, tried, and sentenced to 2 years hard labor. He then worked as a technician for a few years before he was allowed back into the university. And then he came back to university, graduated, and now worked as an engineer in a factory. And we became very good friends, he, his girlfriend, and myself. And he lived in a tiny one room in a building not far from mine. And we had a code where we could contact one another by telephone, always a public telephone. He would never use the telephone in my apartment. And we would meet up and do things together, go to a park or go and have a beer somewhere in a park. Very enjoyable. One day he said to me, Ron, I have managed to buy a place on a government tour to Istanbul, and I'm not coming back. I'm going to defect. And I want you, I can't tell my girlfriend because she might be an informant. So I want you to tell her uh, when you hear my name on Radio Free Europe, because you could listen to defectees' names on Radio Free Europe 2 or 3 weeks after they had defected. I want you to tell Gabby that I defected. So that was a tough one, actually. Anyway, the day came for Dudu to leave, and I waited for his name to come up on Radio Free Europe, and it didn't come up on Radio Free Europe. And I waited and waited, and then I thought maybe he didn't leave at all. So I called his apartment, and no answer. Again, I called his apartment, let it ring for the longest time, and Dudu picked the phone up. We used our code. I met up with him, and he was a shadow of his former self. He told me what had happened. Before he left, he'd sold everything he had, and he had very little. So his apartment, his room, was empty. And the night before he left, a Securitate officer came to his door, knocked at his door at 11 o'clock at night, and Dudu didn't want to let him into the apartment because his apartment was empty. And it was obvious what was going to happen. The Securitate officer insisted on coming into his apartment, didn't bat an eyelid when he saw that the apartment was empty, told Dudu that when he was in Istanbul, what they wanted him to do was to report on the movements of every other member of the group that he was with. And of course, Dudu said, yes, of course I will do that. But then when Dudu got to the airport, he was going through the final security check and he was told, go home, you're not going on the trip. That's it, you've had it. So he went back to an empty apartment. And that was the story of Dudu. It broke him. It absolutely. I've never seen anybody so broken in my life as Dudu after that. And then he desperately had to go about trying to buy his things back so that his girlfriend wouldn't know that he had intended to defect when he was in Istanbul.
Wow. Wow. amongst many names here, Harold Mesh.
Yes, Harold Mesh was a professor at Bucharest University, professor of American poetry. He was a Romanian, Saxon. Ethnically, he was a Saxon. There were many minorities in Romania, and he was a Saxon from Transylvania, from a town called Hermannstadt. His wife he became friends with me at his request, and his wife lived in Hermannstadt. Sibiu is the Romanian name for it, and she had leukemia. And she had been given permission to go in the future to West Germany to get treatment. She was going to die, but she was being sent to West Germany. She was going to be invited to West Germany by relatives so that she could get treatment in West Germany. And he desperately wanted to accompany her to West Germany. So he may have made friends with me to be an informant in order to gain points to get to go to West Germany. But these are things that you didn't think about, and I still put them to one side. But I'm just saying that because these were always the doubts that were in your mind. Harold was an absolute delight of a person. He asked me to spend the New Year in Hermannstadt, and I did. I spent New Year of 1968, 1969 with a group of Saxon men, Romanian Saxon men. His father was one of them, and they had all spent time in Soviet gulags, Soviet work camps. Because what had happened was Romania had started off supporting the Germans, and the Romanian minority were taken off, the men were taken off to fight for the Germans in Western Europe. And his father and these other men with him had been taken prisoner at the end of the war by the Americans, and then had been allowed to return to Romania. But as soon as they got back to Romania, they were picked up by the Russians and taken to pay for war damage up into the Soviet Union to rebuild cities and factories and whatever it was. They had been gone 10 years. Harold didn't know his father for 10 years. So through him, I had some absolutely wonderful experiences that I would never, ever have had access to had I not allowed myself to be open to that kind of invitation.
I think I've said this before, but this is what makes the book, is there's so many stories in here, like stories within stories, like you said here. And the next one I wanted to ask you about was Dino Sandulescu.
Dino became probably one of my closest friends after he defected. Dino was a professor at Bucharest University. He again approached me to become friends with him. We became friends, and he was a Communist Party member. He wasn't a representative for the faculty. He was an independent Communist Party member, and he told me he was. A very interesting man, very highly educated, as were all of the professors that I knew there. And I guess the important thing is that when I left in 1969, I went to Edinburgh University and did a postgraduate degree, and then was given a position in Newcastle upon Tyne. He called me at my office in Newcastle upon Tyne in the early 70s, and he said, "Ron, I am in Helsinki. I'm going to defect. I'm on an official mission with a group of communists in Helsinki. I'm going to defect. We've got to work out a plan for me." His plan was to defect to Britain, which would not have been a good idea because he had been the recipient of a professorial scholarship a few years earlier. And had he defected to Britain, he would have been given sanctuary. He would have been given, what is it called, amnesty, refugee status. but it would have damaged the cultural exchange program. So we discussed Sweden, which was much closer, much easier for him to get to, and would accept him very willingly. So I had a good friend in Uppsala who would be able to offer him a position, a researcher's job. So Dino flew to Stockholm, then to Uppsala, got a job with a friend of mine in Uppsala, and we remained in contact for many years. He built himself an international reputation as a Joycean scholar. He was brilliant, and he's written some of the most important books on James Joyce. But we met up regularly. I visited him in Sweden. He visited me in England and in Scotland. And one day he said to me, "Ron, you'll never guess. I have an uncle who left Romania in the 1930s. He was a chemical engineer. He made a fortune in France with patents, and he has just died and left me all his money. Must have been a big fortune." Dino didn't mention how much it was, but he said, "I'm going to live in his house in Nice." So Dino moved to Nice, and then shortly after, he decided to move to Monaco because he didn't have to pay any tax in Monaco. And Romanians had a thing about, not being controlled by the government. So he left government-controlled France for free Monaco. And in Monaco, he met Anthony Burgess, the novelist, and they became close friends. Anthony Burgess, brilliant man. Dino, brilliant man. They became very good friends. And Anthony Burgess introduced him to Prince Rainier. And he became friends with Prince Rainier. And Prince Rainier invited Dino to be one of the founders of the Princess Grace Memorial Library. Apparently, after she died, Prince Rainier didn't know how to glorify her life or to remember her. And Anthony Burgess said, "Well, she's got all these Irish manuscripts. Why don't you set up a library?" And so Dino's job became, he called himself Georges in those days. When he moved to France, he called himself Georges Sandulescu. Georges, Dino, became the librarian, established the library, and of course, with his background in James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, he turned the library into a center for Irish studies, Irish literary studies. And Dino became known throughout the world as running the annual Best Joycean Conference in Monaco. And I visited him there as well. I was fortunate enough, he invited me to spend some time there, and the library was in the palace. So I got into the palace, into the library, and have a photograph taken at the director of the library's desk there.
Wow. Now, one of the characters that does intrigue me is the one who was teaching English language at a spy school.
Oh, TB Stoyan, yes. Again, TB made the first move and contacted me. Usually what people did was they found out what my timetable was at the university, which was easy to do. It was posted up on a wall, and then they could watch me leave class and then follow me in the street. And once they were far enough away, they would approach me and introduce themselves. And that's what TB did. TB approached me. Usually they had some little request to make of you. It was to translate something for them or to help them in some way. And you knew that was just the first step towards a friendship or a further request. Well, when I got to know Tiberio, I discovered that he told me he spoke English as well as you or me, but he spoke with an RP accent. He spoke with a public school accent. He had never lived in the West, but this was not uncommon. The Romanians mastered the language 100%. You would swear that they had been brought up in Buckingham Palace sometimes. Anyway, TB told me that he wanted to work for the BBC. That was his ambition. And could I help him? It's amazing how people thought that you could help them just because you came from the West. I had no contacts of that kind at all. But he also told me that he taught in a school for spies in Bucharest. Now, I've got no way of knowing that. I've got no reason to disbelieve him. I've got no reason why he even told me that he worked for spies. But when I left, as I say, a few years passed, and I had lost contact with TB. But one day I got a call from a hospital, a mental hospital in England, saying that Tiberiu Stoian wanted to contact me, and could they give him my telephone number? And I asked what the situation was, and they said, this is a mental institution. He has been committed to this institution temporarily because he landed at Heathrow Airport, and when he approached the immigration official and was asked for his passport, he said, "I'm free," and started dancing around and making an exhibition of himself. So he's been taken into custody until we find out about him. So I was a little bit worried because I didn't know whether maybe he'd come out as a Securitate officer and maybe his job was to become an infiltrator in the West. So I had no way of knowing whether or not he had told the British authorities that he'd worked in the spy school. Obviously, important piece of information. So I asked to speak to the psychiatrist in charge, and I told the psychiatrist in charge who I was. I told him that Tibi had, as far as I knew, had taught in the spy school in Bucharest, and that should be added to his dossier, and it duly was. He was released from the mental institution and came to stay with me in Newcastle upon Tyne for some time, and was terribly disappointed with the standard of living. I had a semi-detached house, and many Romanians thought that everybody in the West lived in a mansion, a beautiful mansion, and had a big car. I didn't even have a car. And he was quite taken aback. He said, "Why are you living here? Why are you not living in a nicer house? And where's your car?" And I had to explain to him that life in the West, especially in Newcastle upon Tyne, wasn't easy. There were lots of unemployment in that time. It was the early 70s. And my salary was, I think it was £2,025 a year, which was not very much money. It allowed me to pay a mortgage. That was about it. But TB didn't like Britain very much, and he couldn't get a job with the BBC, so he left for Germany and got a job with Radio Free Europe.
Wow. Ivan Denesh, is that pronounced?
Ivan Denesh, most interesting person of all. He was introduced to me by M's mother. She said, "We have a friend who is a novelist, a member of the Writers and Artists Union. He really wants to meet you. Would you be willing to meet him?" And I said that I would. And so they made an arrangement whereby I met him separately in a park. And Ivan was a little guy like me. I'm 5'7". Ivan was about 5'7". He was a bit older than I was, maybe 10 or 15 years older. One of the most interesting people I have ever met in my life. Spoke fluent English, German, Hungarian, Italian, Romanian. He was a Hungarian Jew who had found himself on the wrong side of the border after the Second World War, and so had simply learned Romanian and become a journalist. He'd been a journalist, but he had spent 8 years in one of the worst prisons in Romania, Gherla, and he told me about it. Much of it was underground. The prisoners were put underground for months at a time. Eventually, they were allowed out one day a week. And he said he used to get beaten up on a Sunday by the guards because he was a little guy, and the guards used to get drunk, and they would pick on the little guy to beat up at the weekends to have some fun. But Ivan never asked me for anything. He was one of these friends that you just enjoyed being with. He introduced me to his wife. It was his second wife, or maybe even his third wife. She was a Romanian girl, not a Jew. And he had a son, Adam, and he lived in an apartment in one of these enormous blocks on the edge of the city, into which people were put before the buildings were even finished, before there were roads, before there were even paths to the buildings. You had to walk through mud about a foot deep to get to these buildings. It was unbelievable, the conditions that they lived under. Anyway, he had an apartment to himself, his wife, and his son. And I met one of his fellow prisoners there in his house. Again, very interesting situation. But Ivan was interested in being invited to British embassy cultural parties because interesting people came from Britain to visit Romania through the cultural exchange program. And Ivan was always interested in interesting people. The editor of I think it was a Sunday Times literary supplement, I think that was what it was coming to visit. And Ivan heard about it through the Writers and Artists Union and asked if I could arrange a meeting with that gentleman for him. That was a difficult thing to do because I didn't like asking Tony Mann for favors. But Ivan was a good friend. I knew that the literary editor would be very impressed by Ivan. He was a well-known novelist in Romania, and he was a very highly intelligent and educated person. So Tony allowed me 2 hours on a Sunday morning alone with this gentleman, and we decided to meet up in Herăstrău Park, in a restaurant in Herăstrău Park. Well, after taking all the usual precautions, Ivan would walk by the restaurant 3 or 4 times, check everybody in it, and then he came in and sat down, and he only stayed for 20 minutes. After all the effort that I had made, Ivan got up suddenly and left and said, I've got to go. When I spoke to him the following day and said why, after all the trouble I had taken, he left so abruptly, he said something that really showed how Romanians perceived themselves, Romanians, Hungarians perceived themselves, how Central European intellectuals perceived themselves. They knew their own value. And he said to me, Ron, I have read all European literature. So has the editor of the literary supplement. But the difference between us is he has read it in translation. I've read it in the original. I don't waste my time with people who have to read literature in translation.
Well, brilliant. Brilliant. Now, how do you end up being invited to a duck shooting party at a Romanian Communist Party hunting lodge?
Yep, I ask myself that sometimes as well. I've no idea why Sika Stavoiu and his wife made friends with me. To this day, I don't understand it. But I went to spend a few days skiing in Sinaia, in the Carpathians, and I was staying in a villa by myself, again, no friends around, and the maid in the villa said, there's a villa I clean for, and these people would invite you to a party if you're interested. I said, well, I'm a Westerner. They wouldn't want to invite a Westerner. She said, oh, no, these people don't mind you being a Westerner. So I thought, okay, sure. So she came back that night and she said, you're invited to a party tomorrow night in their house. And that's the villa up there. It was a private villa. It wasn't one of the ones where you could simply buy a bed for the night. And I got to the villa. I'd never seen anything like it in Romania before. There were all Romanians. There were obviously Securitate, armed Securitate officers there at the door and inside the house. And everybody was drinking and smoking Western cigarettes and drinking whiskey, and they had bottles on the tables. It was something. And Sika Stavoyou was the host, and his wife Annie. And I couldn't get over it. And they were perfectly willing to speak to me, perfectly willing to put up with my poor Romanian. They saw me as a kind of an extra bit of prestige at their party. They had got a Westerner to their party. And they had come up from Bucharest in a chauffeur-driven limousine, and the chauffeur was simply waiting for them for days until they went back to Bucharest. Well, I had to go back the following day, and I was going to take the early train, and I said to Annie and Sika, I'm going to leave now because I've got a train to catch. And she said, a train? You travel by train? I said, yes, I do. And she said, oh, no. We've got a chauffeur-driven car. He'll take you down there, and he'll come back for us. And so they put me in a chauffeur-driven, I don't know if it was a Zim, a Zif, or a Chaika. I think it was a Chaika. Great, big, beautiful Russian car. And I was sitting in the back with these curtains drawn around me, being driven by a chauffeur, a Romanian chauffeur, down to my apartment. It was unbelievable. But Sika would call me after that and make an arrangement for me to meet his wife, Annie. He never turned up, but she and I would have coffee together down in the old town of Bucharest. And she was a delightful companion. She was also a very attractive woman, and she always put up with my Romanian. She allowed me to speak in Romanian without interrupting me or trying to speak in a foreign language, which was what I was seeking. And she said one day, you're invited to a party at our house in Bucharest, and then to a duck shoot at Lake Snagov the day after. And I thought, my goodness, why? I'd never shot a duck. I'd been a beater in Scotland where I had accompanied guns, and they were shooting grouse or they were shooting pheasants, and I was the one doing the beating, doing the raising of the birds. But I'd never fired a shotgun in my life. I'd been in the British Army, but the shotgun was the one arm that we never used. We used every other arm that the British infantry used, from revolver to rocket launchers and everything in between. But I'd never shot a shotgun in my life. Anyway, she told me how to get to their house. They gave me the address, and she told me how to dress for the hunt the next day. So I wasn't going dressed for a party. I was going dressed for the hunt. And I got to this house, and again, there were guards on the door outside. There were miliziani in the street outside. And inside, again, there were armed guards in civilian clothes inside the house. And there were photographs around the wall. And I could recognize some of the photographs. One of them, I remember, was of the strikers outside the Gara de Nord back in I think it must have been the 30s, when the Communist Party was getting going, and there were strikes in Bucharest. And she pointed her father out in one of the photographs. And she even showed me his walking stick, which was a sword stick. You'll probably remember them. I remember the sword stick, which was a stick, was a sword, a long rod, actually, a steel rod, which would be lethal, inside a stick, and that was her father's stick. Anyway, the party was, again, very unusual, very interesting for me, and I was given a bed for a few hours so that I could rest, and then before dawn we drove out to Lake Snagov to a private estate, a private hunting estate on Lake Snagov for Communist Party members, and it must have been for high echelon Communist Party members. And the one instruction I got from Sika was, do not speak Romanian. I don't want people to know that you're not Romanian. So I didn't open my mouth. And we got into the hunting lodge, which was luxurious, had boar's heads, antlers around the walls. There was breakfast for us. There was trika, which is the plum brandy that they drank there. And then there were gamekeepers or gillies. They had the shotguns. He gave us our shotgun. He gave us cartridges for the shotgun. We had them broken open and the cartridges were in our pockets. They weren't loaded when we went into the boats. Sika and I went into a boat with a ghillie, and other guests went again to a boat with a ghillie as well. And we sat out there for hours in the freezing cold dawn, waiting for the ducks to come in to feed. And again, a fascinating experience for me. We fired off a few rounds, didn't get anything, and came back for a snack at the Snagoff Hunting Lodge. Again, I've no idea why I was invited, but it was a wonderful experience.
Wow. Wow. So Sika and Annie were sort of almost like Communist Party royalty.
Well, she told me that her father, if I understood her correctly, had been a senior officer in Securitate when it had been set up or during the communist regime. So he had a very high position in Securitate. And apparently her family, her mother and she, had inherited all the privileges that went with being of the family of a senior Securitate officer. That's how I understood it, but I never, in Romania, you never got to the bottom of things. You never really were certain that you had fully understood what was going on or what the subtext was. Because Romanians were very good at saying things to you and expecting you to interpret it in a slightly different way from the words that were being used. I was pretty good at that. I never put my foot in my mouth or in anybody else's mouth when I was there. But I always had the feeling that I never really 100% understood what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I made a best guess.
No, I can understand that. It sounds like there's a lot of ambiguity when they say something. It's for you to interpret. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was your encounter with some tanks.
Oh yes, that was the most frightening experience that I had there. It was Romanians are fast-thinking people. I always felt that they were 10 steps ahead of me, but this was one moment in which I felt that I thought fast enough to get myself out of a difficult situation. An English friend of mine, a lawyer in the city of London, came out to Romania for a 2-week holiday. Very excited to be behind the Iron Curtain. So I put on, I had the consul's car for a couple of weeks, and I put on a very extensive tour for him. And I happened to mention to M where we were going. And she came back to me and said, could my mother and I come with you on the tour? Again, why? I found that inexplicable. I said, yes, they could come. So we picked them up at the Gara de Nord, not at their house. And eventually we ended up, we went up as far as the Soviet border at a place called Siret, where that's in Bukovina, where the painted monasteries are. So I was taking Howard, my lawyer friend, and M and her mother to see the painted monasteries. They had already seen them, but Howard had not. Well, we got to Siret, and there was the entry-exit point into the Soviet Union, but we couldn't see anything very well. And Howard said to me, could we find a road that goes up the hill a little bit so that we can look into the Soviet Union. I'd like to see it. So sure enough, I found a side road that seemed to be going a little bit uphill. And unfortunately, the road deteriorated into a track, a muddy track, a gravel track. And suddenly we came round a bend, and I was faced with a group of tanks dug into the ground in battle position with their turrets, their guns facing the northern border, facing the border with the Soviet Union. They were all disguised, they were all camouflaged, they had camouflage netting over them, and slowly I could see there was a headquarters tent camouflaged there as well. And the soldiers it was quite early in the morning, I think, and the soldiers were hanging about, and the officer in charge was shaving in a mirror stuck on a tree. And I thought, my God, what have I got myself into? With the Gordons, we had done one operation with tanks, and I had seen how tanks, when they come to the position that they want to hold, they can spin their tracks in reverse and dig themselves a little bit deeper into the ground to lower their profile and just have their gun turret above the level of the ground, and their visual abilities as well. And so I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew I shouldn't be there. This was something I should never see. So immediately I stopped the car. I said to Howard, "Give me your passport." I said to the girls, "Do not look out of the window. Do not open your mouths." And I got out of the car with the passports in one hand, the other hand open to show it was empty. And the soldiers were totally taken by surprise. But the officer quickly wiped his face, put on his battle dress jacket, and came forward with his pistol, with his revolver in his hand. And I took the initiative, and I said in a very loud voice, "We are lost. We are tourists. I'm taking this friend of mine from Bucharest on a visit of your beautiful country. I'm a professor from Bucharest University. How do we get to Securitate?" So that was what our training sergeant had told us. In a difficult situation, take the initiative and don't let the other person get a step ahead of you. So he took my passports, went off to the tent, which was obviously the communications tent, came back to me and said, "Your passports are not diplomatic passports, yet you're driving in a diplomatic car. Why?" So I explained to him, explained who the car was. He checked again and was satisfied because the Securitate knew where any CD plates were at any given time. They had a way of tracking them. So he said, "Okay, what you do is you turn your car around, you drive to Securitate, and you'll be met by the militia there. Do what they tell you." So we drove to Securitate. I didn't know whether we were going to be arrested by the militia or not. We drove in silence. We got to Securitate. Militia were waiting for us. They checked the car, checked the boot of the car, and said, "Okay, now you drive to," I think it was Radauts. "Stop there. There will be more militia." And they did that in 2 or 3 towns until we got to maybe Suceava or somewhere like that. And then the militia in Suceava said, "Okay, you can go back to Bucharest now. You've been checked away from this sensitive area." But that was the most, I think I was the most proud of that moment in my entire 2 years in Romania, because I took the initiative and explained very quickly to the officer who I was, what we were doing there, and asked for his help to get out of it.
The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.